on flow, right? Why flow? Why is this so important? Do you guys want to offer up some ideas of why we're focusing in on the frontline officers, specifically for this training?
Because they are in the front.
That's right, that's right.
They are the first people
To encounter the threat, right?
first body.
Yeah, so the flow is the first likely point of encounter of a new nuclear security threat. But not just that, right? They have the knowledge and the experience that can be leveraged to deal with the threat as well, right? They typically are police officers, customs, border guards, civil protection services, and so forth. So that's why flow is being addressed here. Has anybody been to this training by any chance? Or maybe even training this training?
Just last month.
So last month you...
We have a national training course for frontline officer in nuclear security detection.
Okay.
I was the course director.
So you were the course director, all right. So maybe you should come up here. Anybody else? Can you share some experiences about the training? It's fairly new. I'll get to that. The concepts aren't brand new. We've been delivering this kind of training for a very long time, but this specific training is new.
For Vietnam, we have, I just 35 participants, and 20 of them is custom, where they have the equipment and the RPM system already set up. And also we have some participants from the border guard control, Coast Guard, and
So
also
you have border guards
Coast
and Coast Guard?
Guard, yeah.
Yeah?
Also some people from the Department of Science and Technology.
Department of
Science.
Science and Technology. That's great.
They are not from my officer, but they are supported.
Right. They need to know how they do the job in the field.
Because for custom, we have the joint circular together. When they see the system have alarm, they can call to Balance. But because Balance the headquarters in Hanoi, and our team, mass team also in Hanoi, so in different province, different area, we cannot deploy immediately the resources. So we have the another response team is Department of Science and Technology in each province.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that the Coast Guard was there, because that's obviously a threat, right? That's a border issue, and they haven't, domestically within the U.S., our Coast Guard's very involved, but we haven't, second line of defense hasn't been addressing the maritime space until just recently, so I'm glad to hear that. Anybody else? I know you did.
Yeah, is this the one which we did the online before we came here?
No, this would not have been an online course. This is being delivered just recently. It's fairly new, and it's kind of it's based off of second line of defense operator training. So if second line of defense has been in your country, like Mombasa, we probably have delivered OT, which is
Thailand. I think it's been presented there too. The OT course, which
yeah,
is very similar to.
it's very similar. But what I'll go back to that. The reason this course is actually being developed is even within the United States, we have our own domestic security program, and then second line of defense is an international program. Even within those organizations within the U.S., we use different terminology. We may teach different concepts, and so this course was put together in coordination with the European Commission, the IAEA, Interpol, the U.S., and the World Customs Organization to harmonize the curriculums that were being delivered for operator training, and specifically addressing the frontline officer, right? Are there any questions about that?
I want to know, this course is, what is the frequency of this course? How many times you have done?
So this is a very new course, but again, every country that we've delivered operator training, the number of times we deliver is very dependent on the country. I have examples where one country we went 5 times, and it's because their turnover rate is so high at that site, they're constantly turning over their staff and constantly having to retrain them. Some sites, they have a very stable staff, and we came in and delivered it once, and then they took over the training, they adopted it, and we haven't even gone back, except for to come and watch them do the training.
Malta's a good example.
Malta is a great example of that. So it's variable based on the countries or the sites even that we work with.
Perform on request of this.
It's very much a relationship per country. Within second line of defense, we have country managers and sustainability managers that engage the country and make those requests for training in that format.
So is it possible that as nationals, we can organize our stakeholders, as the customs authorities and the regulatory body, then we call the experts
Yes.
into our country to come and train the trainers. Maybe, let's say 6 people.
Yeah.
Then these 6 people will be able to train the frontline officers.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Again, let's talk about, Shane mentioned it earlier. We, this is a second line of defense business model. Doesn't necessarily mean it has to be your business model or the IEA, but typically we've come in and taught this course, and then we come in and we teach T3, and then those trainers actually start training this course, and we'll come in and do what's partner country led training. And we take kind of baby steps. The first partner country-led training, we may still provide all the materials, we'll still come, we'll still lead it, but we'll have a trainer from your site, your country, help us. So it will be in coordination. And then the second partner country-led training will be more ownership by the country. They'll provide the materials, they'll adopt the materials, right? Because the materials we bring to the table don't address your threat and your risk at your country level, and they don't address your specific SOPs. So that follow-on training will be delivered from the country with our assistance, or maybe just our, observation.
But it's really, go ahead.
No,
I was going to say it's really important. I think that the whole point of today is we're working with IEA and we're trying to pitch all these different trainings. If you guys are interested in those trainings, please work back with Fitria to get this training. I think the IEA is really excited to help you get this training, whether it's T3 or flow or it's more training, all the things we're talking about today. These are open and available for your countries if you can coordinate through Fitria on those. That part's exciting.
yes.
Yeah, I was referring that as part of the prerequisite for this training, we did an online course by the IEA. I think it's a similar one.
I think the concepts are probably similar. It's not the same course, but the guidelines are probably similar.
Yeah. So actually, the flow is there's another group called the Border Monitor Working Group that's also working with this flow material, and they've created some e-learning prerequisites to this course, and that may be where some of that's coming from. They're just prerequisites and assistance in that course, but this is a full course.
Yeah, this is a full 3 to 5 day course. So, yeah, so anyways, back to the why flow, right? They're the first and likely point to encounter the threat, right? So the mission and purpose of this course is to provide quality training in a relevant situation or scenarios that the frontline officer would see in a regular working environment. So this is specific. This is a very specific course. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because you may take this course and adopt it to your country, and it may not be specific enough, right? There's other things that you might do within your country that are specific, right? Because you have a different threat and risk there. It's also, the purpose is to address, deter, detect, and interdict smuggling of nuclear and radioactive materials by providing practical operational training, so practical and exercise-based. And then to direct an applicable best practices guidance for performance evaluation and technical solutions. And again, we're right here. Fitria mentioned that this is really about detection. And we're specifically in the detect, right up here, radiation detection for flow, and NEST is the next course you'll hear about. And I think we went so far as to put the TTT above that. That would be the train the trainer portion of this, and it's an overlay on top of that. That has not been deployed yet. We have a generic second line defense train the trainer, but IAEA is looking at that and modifying it for this approach. So, any questions about that? You'll hear about the next. The training objectives. What is flow looking for and why? How do they find it? So the how do they confirm it? And what do they do next? What do they do with the information? We do a really good job of training up to about here. And then there was a gap. We went in and started doing our own gap analysis and realized that there was some discomfort in, how do you close out and how do you support your reach back in terms of forensics and so forth. And that was a new occurrence that just happened as Department of Energy has pulled in forensics underneath Second Line of Defense program. And it's because of this gap. Okay, so again, back to the famous diagram, right? Threat and risk assessment. That's something that your country owns. They either share part of that. We assume you don't share the whole story. You share some of that with the IAEA, but you don't share the whole threat analysis piece. The reason that is so important to bring up again and again and again is when you go to do the flow training, you're basing your flow training on CONOPS and SOPs. And those are very specific to the threat, right? How you decide to do your operational procedures in the field is based on that threat analysis. And I'll talk about it a little bit more and reinforce it, but when it comes to how you actually inspect the cargo, how often you inspect the cargo, what kind of, how you do that, what kind of traffic you have coming through that site is really based on that threat analysis. And that is not something that we can tell you how to do carte blanche and then it fits for every site or country. So it's very important for you to own the material, modify it, make it work with your site operations. It's very specific to a job. So again, we talked about the nuclear security detection architecture, MORC, the threat of MORC, right? And now the frontline officer, how they do their job in securing nuclear or other radioactive materials, the MORC. So, and then the next things we'll talk about is MEST, and the support of MEST in that process. So who is the organizer and target audience? Right? It's flow, but who's flow? They're police, border guards, civil protection services, people who protect large critical infrastructure, right? Those are key elements. And back to who the target audience, who else should come to this training? We talked a little bit about this on the first couple days. Not just flow, right? Because what happens when the frontline officer doesn't do his job or wasn't trained right? So what's part of our case study? Who else should attend training? Managers? Yeah, managers. Even policymakers might want to see, right? You had the Department of Science and Technology come to yours, and so they shouldn't be excluded from this training. But definitely, you want the frontline officers to show up.
What's the BMWG?
Oh, that is the Border Monitoring Working Group. That was a group that was put together and included the IAEA, included the U.S., it included World Customs Organizations, it included Interpol, and the whole objective was to harmonize how we were training in the field and the materials that we were releasing to our member states.
And also, Jen, I think when it comes to ports, I think border is a difference. we are red boxes, we have, those are the main ones we have.
Yeah.
You will find that in order for this training to be effective, besides the managers, the other stakeholders, for example, the airports, for the airport security, they might have a role as flows, but maybe usually it's your customs guys.
Right.
Then you've got those who handle cargo, you've got also intelligence. Because what's going to happen when something actually is detected, you know, these are going to come in, you know. So sometimes I think it's important that this is held. They are also there. Otherwise we're going to have training for the customs only, training for...
Yeah, and so a lot of the training that I'll do, we'll have both, right? We'll have customs and border guards together, or the airport. You're exactly right. You want to invite all stakeholders that participate in the process. And again, that's very country-based and even site-based. So, good point. Very good point. Yes.
In most our trainings, we always inviting the person from the headquarters of this, for example, customs, from the Department of Organization of Control.
Yes.
Because they will work in the future. So the frontline officer will just what they will do, but they need to think. Oh, now our structure a little bit will change because we will have the new portal monitor. We will have so. This gentleman's also important.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of the times, especially second line of defense, when we come and deliver OT, it might be a new site entirely. Like we've just deployed hardware there. And so it is very new kind of reorganization and new job duties are added to customs or so forth. So it is important to have the stakeholders at a high level to see the training as well. Good comments, thank you. Prerequisites, it says here, preferred experience as a flow worker, working at the border, crossing seaports, airports, strategic locations. How often do you think that happens? That they actually have experience when we come in and deliver this course?
There could be some experience.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, some of them are brand new. I mean, sometimes the reason we're back there training, or you may introduce more training, is you just have a huge turnover of staff at a border or a port. And so some and some won't have experience working at the site. Hopefully they have an understanding of the overall operation. And again, a lot of these sites, that's not their only job, right? We come in and teach it like that's all their job is, but they have like 10 other jobs or 20 other jobs. But they should understand before sitting in on this course how this relates to their other duties, hopefully.
If you think back to the training needs exercises we've done, it's really important to figure out when and how you're going to integrate courses like this. Some of the most successful training programs we've run into will teach this course or a course very similar to it in their academies. And so all the officers will get exposed to it, and then they'll get more advanced training once they get out and are actually assigned to do radiation detection. But you really have to think about how you're going to deploy the training to all the people involved.
And there's advantages to having it at a training center, and there's also advantages to having it at the site, right? And maybe you tailor the training differently based on the venue, for sure.
But I think for some of us who are venturing into this thing, I think the approach that you are taking, second line of defense project, where even when you're partnering with countries, that you want the first trainings to have the subject matter experts.
Yes.
Right.
You know,
And the managers.
involved, you know, before you release it to the training centers, because obviously because of the size of these organizations, they have mechanisms for training,
Right.
but they don't really have knowledge within this area, you know. So you can just end up having templates that are just used for training, templates for examination. People just go through that, right? But then things like culture, you know, I think we're talking about attitude, skills, and knowledge.
Right.
Certain things where people can only get when they're getting it from somebody, you know, that they know, they're sure this one knows about this. For example, the airport, a trainer who has been there for so many years. So he's now coming and saying, I'm going to be teaching you nuclear security. It's an academy. they're thinking, where do you know that from, you know?
Yeah.
They can go through what they have to, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
to ensure that they pass. But sometimes when they see experts coming in from outside, right, it generates interest and also it brings the objectives, you know.
I can see that, yes, for sure. And maybe you do that, but maybe there's ongoing continual training, more exercise-based, that you do at a lower level there. So again, that's kind of part of your training, sustainable training program that you have to think about. Good point. So course goals, the participants will understand the threat posed by nuclear and radioactive materials out of control, out of regulatory control, the role of flow in countering that threat, and methods and techniques to fulfilling this role. So we talked about, you know, we always think about materials out of regulatory control as like things have been stolen or, you know, they're smuggling it. But how much material do you think is out of, it's not being protected out there, right? There's a lot of materials being transported throughout the world that's not being protected. And this is really about addressing that threat as well, right? It may not be a totally nefarious act that we're looking for. It may be a contamination or an orphan source out there. So this is the course map. And this steps you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's basically 5 days, right? And that, we say 3 to 5 days. I think that's tailored based on site and number of people. But in general, it's a 5-day course. On the first day, we talk about introductions to radiation and radioactive materials. We spend a good hour on this, and it's really just to talk about the general concepts of radiation. Many of the border guards, the flow participants, may have a certain fear of radiation, and so hopefully this shows them how to operate safely around it, but alleviate some of the concerns related to that radiation fear, right? But we do cover it. We do an overview of operational situations and where they might encounter radiation, right? So a lot of these ports have what we call NORM, naturally occurring radioactive materials coming in and out all the time, and they're generating alarms. And whatever site you're at, you need to give them an understanding of what's a NORM alarm and what's an alarm that they need to address. Yeah. Yeah, we have innocent, we have legitimate, you know, so there's all sorts of alarms. So we talk about that on the first day, and then we give a description of the nuclear security threat and risk, right? So we're pretty limited in that if we do it, right? We have the IAEA database, and we have some of our just kind of working knowledge where countries have given us permission to share that information, but you guys have actual detailed information. And that's where your value comes into play, right? It's very important to incorporate those details that you can incorporate into that discussion. Okay, so day 1 is kind of the why. Day 2, 3, and 4 is kind of the how. You know, how do I do my job based on this information? We give an overview of the approach to detection, and that's not just our detection equipment that we deploy, right? There's the information alerts, and that's not just intelligence, right? You get information from hospitals, you get information from the regulatory agency. If a truck carrying a source for a reload all of a sudden goes missing, right? That alert probably comes through your regulatory, right? Is that, I'm asking. In the U.S. it does. It comes from the NRC. Yeah, so that would be a really important piece of information. A truck was just stolen with a cobalt-60 source for reload, or a well logging truck was just stolen. That would be information you'd want to flow to your borders as soon as possible. So there's other forms of intelligence that come through. Social media probably goes up to your, you know, counterintelligence and then back down. But the hospital, you know, people are showing up and they're ill with exposure, nuclear radiation exposure. That would be information that would flow down to those sites.
Maybe a quick question for this movement of concentrates, radioactive what can I say? Concentrates, minerals with some elevated levels of radioactivity. But norms.
Yeah,
Norms, yes. Once they are detected, because obviously when the trucks are passing there, the alarms go on.
That's a site by site basis, and there are ports that they transport toilets all the time through this port, right? And toilets are made of porcelain, and you put enough toilets in a truck, it's going to set off the RPM. But there's ways you can look at the manifest. There's ways you can look at the way the alarm comes in, and you can make a decision, an informed decision, on whether or not to do a secondary inspection or not. And we have big ports, big mega ports. They either decide to do secondary inspection based on that primary alarm. They do random, which is a huge deterrence, right? Because random, you just do a secondary inspection based on a randomness that, a nefarious person would not know how you're going to execute on that. Or they do secondary inspection on everything. So it's a site decision.
And this is, I think, the scenario you talked about where someone put a source in with naturally occurring radiation.
Is that what you're saying?
We have specific scenarios in the frontline officer training that as an alarm goes off, they'll look at the graph of the gamma detection, and we teach them how to look at the graph to find what we call a point source. So usually in naturally occurring radiation, if a truck goes through with toilets per se, you'll have a flat, the graph will go up, you have gamma, and then it'll go down as the truck goes through. If someone's trying to sneak something in, it'll go up, and usually you'll see a point source of that other radiation source.
We talked about the mask.
Yes, masking. So I don't want to get too much into the details, but it's really about the training, and a lot of this flow material talks about, and the other part of it is how you tune the equipment. And anytime, whether it's IEA, Second Line of Defense, other people that install radiation portal monitors, you always tune those portal monitors with taking into account the naturally occurring radiation in the background radiation. That makes a big difference too.
It depends from country to country.
It's not different country to country. It's different from the location to location, depending on what things are, the concrete that's under it, depending on the granite that's under it, and you can do lead shielding and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but that's a really good point, and that's something that we cover specifically in this training, is how do you teach them to find stuff that people are trying to hide?
But again, going back to this threat and risk, right? If you know that this threat is really high, you might decide in your SOPs to do 100% secondary inspection. If you're at a megaport, that might be totally impossible. You basically shut down the port trying to do that. So you have to weigh the traffic, the risk, and that's a decision you make at that higher level, right? And then that information trickles down to the SOPs, and then you train to it, right? We're not going to make the decision at the training level on that one. So, good question though. Okay, so again, day 3 is about that secondary inspection. How do you look at that alarm? How do you decide whether or not you need to do a secondary inspection, whether or not you can release it, and whether or not to detain or release, right? Day 4, how do they do what do they do when they find something? So yeah, they go through their secondary inspection, they actually find something. And it's a cobalt-60 source, and it's in a cargo that the manifest says toys. Right, that's bad. So they have to make a decision.
Now what?
Yeah, now what? I'm going to detain. And how am I going to detain? What's the best method to detain? And who am I going to reach back to? Who's the higher authority? So we teach a whole day on that, right? And then the last one, and again, I think this incorporates some materials that Second Line of Defense started realizing our training had a gap in, and that's, how do you support follow-up? How do you support law enforcement? It's a crime scene now. So what kind of data and documentation do you preserve and supply, and how can you support those people in the crime scene investigation? Okay? I think we specifically call out forensics. And again, we can categorize, we can say what the isotope is, but we can't necessarily say the details about where that isotope might have come from, You know, there's forensic information. I think there's some other forensic people in the room, but you can give details of where the origin of that material might have come from with the forensic side. A little bit more about scope, right? The training course is designed to promote flow awareness and give materials on how flow will encounter nuclear security threats, risks, detection, approaches, alerts, assessments, and secondary inspection process, and how to respond, how to use the response support for this. I think, you know, this top statement, understand flows, really the scope is understanding flow's role in this process, right? Their role in methods, techniques for encountering threat posed by nuclear and radiological materials out of regulatory control. So the flow's roles in this include understanding the nuclear material and transport methods and documentation, right? Understanding what comes in and out of that port or in and out of that border. Understanding what's a normal transport of materials, so and what proper documentation comes with that. And understanding, the only way to understand what's not normal is to understand what's normal. I mean, that's why it's so important. And you need to understand the transportation documentation that's required in your country. Another one that is very difficult for second line of defense to describe for you, right? You have your own documentation. It may be very similar to ours for transportation, but you have your own rules. And so we need to be able to train them on what to look for in that documentation. So understanding the threats and risks and the consequences of those risks. Again, we get a lot of our information from our partner countries that give us permission to share that, and also the IEA, but you guys might have details that you could add to that. So the other role of the flow is to assess alarms, to understand the detection approaches, right? You have your information alerts, and you have things that come down from your detectors. How to assess those alarms, and how to conduct a secondary inspection, and how to support the crime scene management. Right? So in a nutshell, that's the overall overview. It's a 3 to 5 day course. To be honest, it's really a 5-day course the way it's designed. Sometimes it gets pushed into 3 days, but that's not, from a training perspective, that's not a good thing to be forcing a 5-day course into a 3 days. The course structure, it's classroom taught. The concepts are taught in the classroom. There's 10 lectures, but they're emphasized with exercises, they're practical exercises, and then scenario-based practical exercises in the field. The course instructor evaluates the individual participants based on these practical exercises and hands-on checks. Again, that might be different. You guys might adopt more of a testing approach. It might be a written test. We don't do that with Flow right now. But again, I think you're in a better position to test your staff than we are, right? And our course is not accredited, right? You may have a more accredited course within your training centers and so forth. So this is just this specific course, how we deploy it. Again, 10 lectures that are reinforced with activities and exercises. So, course arrangement. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because it's kind of, you got to prepare to do training, right? And it's kind of one of my pet peeves. I'll end up doing a lot of training and ends up being in a venue that I didn't think I was walking into, and the participant number is way different than I thought. So you really have to prepare and organize the training. This training is designed for a training room and with one additional discussion room for offline discussions. We highly emphasize having the actual detection instrumentation there at the training. Much of it is exercise-based and hands-on. And so if you don't have these devices and the right number of devices, right, that's a problem. The course is designed for 12 participants, so from the people who have been to a flow course, how many people showed up? I think you said 35?
Yeah,
35, okay. So 35, anybody else who's been to this training? I delivered a training with 30. But it really should be 12, right? And if you have 30, you should probably have 4 instructors, and you should probably have twice as many devices, because now all of a sudden you're handing around a device to 30 people, and they're not getting the hands-on experience they should get. So this number of participants impacts the number of devices you have and the number of instructors that are helping. I've been to training that's had 3 participants for 2 instructors and 30 participants. And I enjoyed the 3. It's an awful lot, it's a waste of resources, but you know, they got a lot of hands-on, they learned quite a bit that time. But the optimal number is 12, right? What do you think the issue with this is? Bringing sources to the training. Might not be an issue at the training centers, but you can't just say one day, oh, hey, let's bring sources, right? It takes coordination. In the US and every site I've gone to, it takes having a person show up that is allowed to handle sources, a source handler. Not everybody's allowed to touch and handle and carry around sources, right? Huh?
You have the buenos for
Yeah, you might have them at the border site. So there's a person responsible for it, but you know, in general, people try to control where sources are. What are some other types of radioactive material that you might want to think about having at your training?
No.
Yes. Yeah, we often forget about that, but it's like, you know, it'd be nice to have some norm around so people can see what, you know, what porcelain, you know, get enough porcelain in the same spot, what that looks like.
Ceramics, some granites,
Yeah.
bananas.
Bananas, coffee, salt.
Thorium light elements, right?
Yeah. Some watches that have tritium in them.
Yep. So yeah, think about that when doing your training.
So in our national training course, we have around 2 hours to talk about what is the norm and what is the norm the FLO can follow.
Yeah.
They from the beginning they have no idea about norm, but after that they get to know in normal situation without the risk from radiation, they also can make a norm.
Yeah, it's everywhere, right? And they need to understand that, you know, radiation is everywhere, and the equipment we give them really makes them safer and more. They know more about their situation. It's actually a good thing, not a scary thing. But the getting comfortable with the term norm, so naturally occurring radioactive material, is, I think, very important. Sometimes we underemphasize it in the training. So thank you.
Sorry.
Yes.
So you mentioned here radiation detection instruments again. Will you use the portal monitors or vans or what?
Depends on the site, right? I mean, your training, if your country doesn't have any mobile vans, probably not going to deliver training yet. But if your training, if your site, you know, maybe you're doing it at a port, has RPMs and they should have PRDs, which are the personal devices, radioactive detectors, and they should have RIDs, but we have a lot of different types of RIDs, right? So again, back to the training, it should be specific. It should be the right device in the room. Even Thermo has 4 different types of identifiers, right? Hopefully, the training you do is on the right device that they will use in the job. But
The training is more effective if you can be in an area where the RPMs are close, so you can talk about the RPMs, talk about the secondary inspection areas, and go actually practice. But you can't always be there.
some of the training centers they've installed them for training purposes.
We can make a simulation of the portal.
Yes.
Yeah, I've seen sites do that as well.
Yeah, what exactly I want to say, because in Vietnam we have no training center where we can have the simulation of RPM. So we have around 3 hours to bring them into the real site, and we bring also the radioactive sources to see how the alarm can generate and how they can follow. And in the morning and in the afternoon perform simulate the secondary inspection.
Okay, yeah, that's one way to handle it, is do the classroom first and then go out to the field and do it, to get the hands on it. I think it's really specific for this, important that they are in the environment, or an environment that simulates their job as much as possible. Any more comments on this? What else is not listed here? Maybe you're at a border and you want to you've done your classrooms, you've done your practical exercises, and you want to do a scenario-based training at the end. What did I not list here? Any ideas? So people, right? You need actors, right? A driver. So the scenarios we do at sites, we will have a driver that we'll put a source on a cargo armed truck, and we'll have the driver drive through the RPM, generate a real alarm at their site, and then have the participants do a secondary inspection. So the driver, if you're at a site, you need to coordinate who's going to do that. Okay, good discussion. The course content, we're going to go over kind of why. I think we went over this already. How. So how do you detect, take some information alert and use suspicious indicators and use your detectors to find a threat? What do you do when you do have a primary alarm and when you decide to do your secondary inspection? And then who do you reach out to if you do find something? And how do you support the crime scene? So I'm just going to break down these days and go over them very quickly. So what is the flow looking for, right? So types of materials you need to define. Again, this gets back to they need to know what's normal radioactive material, and then they need to know what the threat is. So what are some materials that can come in and out of their port that would be a threat? And they need to know what the documentation might look like. And they need to be able to determine if they should do a secondary inspection on that or not. So how do they do their job, right? So information alerts might come in. They might have just suspicious behavior. A lot of the events that people have found sources on people going through borders has just been based on suspicious behavior. It hasn't even been detected through the RPMs, I'm sorry to say. It's just, they walked up to do an interview with the driver, he seemed kind of edgy, fidgety, and they decided to do a full inspection on the car. So we don't want to come in and train these frontline officers to forget all their other senses, all their other training, and just use the detectors. That's the last thing we want to do. We're only adding this as a tool on top of their other training. So it's very important to talk about that. Some of those physical indicators could be anything from they look like they have radiation sickness, maybe they look ill, they're wearing protective clothing, they have gloves and things that you might PPE for radioactive material. Maybe their car is weighted down. That's a really bad sign. It could be a sign that they're trying to shield something. So if they have a car that's sagging, that might be an indication to do a secondary inspection. And then, obviously the detectors go off, right? So we talk about that during the first day. And then second day, we talk about how do they do this, right? So how do they get the alert and the alarm coming in? How do they make the decision to whether or not to do a secondary inspection? That could be 100% secondary inspection, and I'm a huge advocate of that, right? At borders where there's like 5 people coming in across the border a day, I mean, just use it as practice, right? Why not? So it could be 100% secondary inspection. You could do a secondary inspection and have no reason at all to do it. But ports, big mega ports, can't do that. And so they have to have a way of deciding when to do that secondary inspection. And so we talk about that on the next day. And then we talk about how to do that, right? What's the appropriate manner to do an inspection? So what are the kind of, we call them conveyances. What would be the kind of conveyances that you might do a secondary inspection on. You're either in an airport, you're in a megaport, you're just on a border. So what are the types of things you would do secondary inspection on? Well, if you're at the airport, you have people, right? People are coming in and they may set off the alarms. If you're at a port, you have containers. If you're at the border, you might have people and cars. Trucks. So the way you would do your secondary inspection for all these different conveyances is very different, right? You would not do a secondary inspection on a person the same way you would do it on a container. So we teach very specifically, how they would do a secondary inspection on the different entities, right? And you have to teach them, just because a person is setting off an alarm, it doesn't mean they're a criminal, right? You have to be sensitive to that. They could have just had a medical procedure where they're still radioactive, and the last thing you want to do is harass somebody who is sick. So you need to do your job, you need to do that secondary inspection, but you need to be sensitive to the individuals. The driver of a cargo that has a radioactive source in it might not even know that there's something back there. So they're not necessarily a criminal, but you can't let them run off, right?
I have a comment to this picture.
Which, the one?
No,
Oh, the picture.
it's good picture to explain them. It's not good to
That's not
two-
effective.
two persons inspection in one place in
Yeah.
one time.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? They're not effectively working as a team. And we do that, right? In the practical exercises, you'll split up into teams, and one of the things they usually fail to do on the first round is collaborate and give roles to people. So they'll all run over and do the same thing, and then they'll run over here and do the same thing, but they have to work out a team and figure out how to work together, and you'll see this. Yes?
In my opinion, I think the risk is for secondary inspection, and for the primary detection, before identifying, we need to search where the hotspot, and in this case we can have compare. Of course, it is the simulation, but in the real situation we can have compare together, because if the equipment is not yet calibrated, so we
Yeah.
should have comparisons.
You'll see that a bit. One way to do that is, everybody does the screening, taking notes is really important, but you'll come back with either another one or a better one, right? We have Vortex or some other device to confirm. That's a good point. But if you're trying to be efficient about the screening, you might do that as a follow-on.
If it says uranium or plutonium, you usually try it again just to make sure.
Yeah, exactly. Good point. So what to do when the material is found, right? We talked about the secondary inspection site, right? You want to get the cargo out of traffic flow to do your secondary inspection, but what if you actually find something in there, right? What are the things you have to worry about? What's the number one thing you should worry about?
Of course, your safety.
Yeah, your personal safety, right? You want to set up a safety zone. And then, right now, it's a potential crime scene, so what's the second most important thing?
Communication.
Security.
Secure.
And then making the call to your higher authority, right? And that's based on your location and your SOPs. So you guys must be starting to get a feeling how important it is for you guys to design your training very specific to your SOPs, because it's hard for us to determine that if we're not part of your organization. So, yeah. So we go over that, we talk about methods, but again, it's based on an SOP and who your higher authorities are, what your reach back protocol is. But this discussion is really giving them awareness that this is a crime scene and to protect the evidence. But primarily safety and security are the issues at play. And then, how flow can support follow-up. This is kind of that piece of, again, you can take notes are really important, right? If you call back to your reach back authority, they're gonna wanna see the spectrum off of your devices, right? They're gonna wanna see the alert page from your central alarm station. And all that will help them determine, the next steps, right? So notes, data, they're all important, and we need to teach the frontline officer to collect that. They can help in this investigation. The other thing they need to do is if they collect data, they need to specify how they collected the data, right? That people often forget to do that, right? Like, I collected this off an identifier, and this is the serial number one of the device I used. So we can go back to it and then pull that data off of there if they lose it. I think we already talked about this. It's a 3 to 5 day course. Again, presentation style, demonstration, very important, and then giving them hands-on experience with the devices. There's group discussions to reinforce. A lot of these guys might have experience and some might not, so it's nice to get them to talk amongst themselves and learn from each other. And then we do practical exercises and course evaluation. Yes?
How do you decide whether to make it 3 days or whether to make it 5 days?
I don't like that they put a bracket in there, but it really is a 5-day training course. I think if you decided to break it into 3 days, it would be either a refresher. So it really comes down to your needs analysis, right? Is this a intro to operator training? Or is this a refresher to reinforce some of the gaps that you might be seeing in the field?
Sometimes management that may not understand the importance of it says, I will only give my people for 3 days, not 5 days, and you have to adapt.
And that's not a good place to be.
No.
Right? Trying to do this course in 3 days is not helpful. I've been put in this situation, right? But you really, if you're going to spend the resources to do it, why not do it right? And why not be effective? But that's a good question. I would have
maybe for the refresher training.
Yeah, I think that's right. Sometimes, they'll realize, we might make changes to the equipment, right? And so we don't have to do a full-on operator training. We just need to come in and emphasize the changes we made and kind of reinforce some of the concepts. Good question. So summarize this, right? Flow serves an important role in achieving a defense in-depth security, right? This is a multi-layered approach, right? You have your official and unofficial points of entry, and then you have your target. And so you need detectors at all layers of this to be effective, right? And so flow is a major part of that defense architecture. So these are some of the references that we use to build this curriculum. Some. I think it's a pretty all-inclusive list. There's on. There's many case studies actually in the course, which is nice. Again, these are case studies that they've reported to the IAEA and given us permission to share. But you might have specific threats that are more important to share than these generalized studies.
If you get a chance to do this course, this is one of my favorite courses because you actually get to do stuff. I mean, you're learning about detection, but then you go out and you're actually scanning people and vehicles and finding out how those SOPs actually work. And for me, a lot of the lecture is good, but I really understood what we're doing, why we're doing it, and it really makes sense to management and makes sense to the operators. Oh, this is really important. This is the stuff we're looking for. It's a great course.
Yeah, so the first 3 days is heavily lecture, hands-on, right? Getting your hands on the devices. And through the fourth day, we start doing these scenario-based practical exercises. And that really kind of shows the operator, yeah, okay, I get it. We split them into groups. We'll have one group that will be the nefarious, the bad guys. We'll have one group that will be the frontline officers, and then we'll have an observation group. And we'll let the observers kind of give feedback. And it's fun. It's fun. And you do that a couple times, and they really kind of they understand their own gaps, right? It's really more about them realizing, hey, yeah, I need to practice this. I don't want to do this for the first time when it happens. And that's really the realization. Because we can't practice every scenario, because we don't know what the scenario will be. What we do want to do is kind of walk them down the road of these are scenarios we should practice as a group once second line of defense or IEA leaves. And we should continue to talk about this stuff. And these things that get reported to the IEA should be delivered back in training, right? So the things that you provide to the IEA will inform other countries and vice versa. It's part of the training system. I think that's it. I don't want to pushing up against lunch here, but yeah, I'd appreciate any feedback, questions, comments. Yes.